Hi guys, welcome back to the podcast. Got a special guest today, Toby Harden, who's the author of Bandit Country, and it's a book about South Armagh in Northern Ireland, and pretty much about the IRA unit there and all that. And it's not biased, and it's not pro IRA because he's an Englishman at the end of the day. But it's the first book I found. It was written like almost 20 years ago, but it's the first book I found that was very even keeled and factually based and not biased one way or the other. Because generally, you read books about Northern Ireland or any conflict, really, where you sit is where you stand, right? So you're going to get a biased opinion left or right. And this one was very, very well written because the area he's talking about is a couple of miles north of where I grew up. And it's the northern part of the Northern Ireland border where I patrolled the southern part. And a lot of the things in here I remember happening. At least one of them I was actually there when it happened. So really looking forward to this. Toby, thank you so much for doing this. Welcome to the podcast.
Oh, thanks so much, Kevin. Glad to be here.
Yep. I listened to your interview with Jack Carr because I wanted to kind of find out more about your background and all that. Can you kind of just nutshell I know you've had a long career, you've been all over the place. But can you kind of give us a little kind of peek into your background and how this happened, how you wanted to, because I know you were in London when an IRA bomb went off and that kind of triggered you to go write this book. But can you just give us the 5 minute spiel on your background?
Yeah, sure. So I grew up in Manchester, uh, northwest of England, went to a kind of Catholic school, lots of Irish there. Um, I left school in 1984. So if you do the math, I'm 59, and so I turned 59 a couple of days ago. So it has been a long career. It's kind of frightening. But I joined the Navy right out of school, but I got a cadetship to university. So I did a year's basic officer training at Dartmouth in Devon in the UK and at sea. And then I went to Oxford for 3 years, studied history, and then uh, graduated from university and thought about what do I want to do, and I continued with the Navy because I wanted to sort of see through the commitments and I wanted to do it properly. About 50% of the people on that scheme kind of dropped out immediately after university or even before. But I did end up doing 6.5 more years in the Navy, so a total of 10 years service. But I was kind of frustrated that I wasn't at the sharp end. I went to lots of nice places all around the Caribbean, went to Australia twice, but it didn't seem real. I tried to get to Bosnia, they wouldn't let me go.
Hmm.
I was in Scotland for the Gulf War, and I always felt I was sort of missing out on everything. And I'd grown up, I'm fourth generation military. I'd grown up on stories from my grandfather from World War II and taking his medals out of his little tin box and everything. And
Hmm.
so I thought, well, how do you get to where the action is essentially? And I thought, journalism was it, and that's how it turned out. So I got a foot in the door at the Telegraph in about 1994, just as I was leaving the Navy. Did a couple of years in London as a sort of news reporter, like a fireman. When they they kind of shout across the newsroom that there'd been a murder or a shooting or whatever. But
Hmm.
one of the last of those stories was um, the South Key bomb in February 1996. And at that point, I was already penciled in to go and be the island correspondent for the Telegraph, based in Belfast,
Hmm.
which there was this kind of sense in the newspaper and maybe in Britain generally that the story was over. There'd been an IRA ceasefire in August '94. But anyway, that bomb was the end of the ceasefire. And, I remember, we're in Canary Wharf. I think it was the biggest building in London at the time, and that building shook.
Hmm.
Not much, but it shook, and the lifts were out, and we ran downstairs with 14 floors or whatever it was, and I'm reporting on this bomb with all the sort of glass crunching under my feet, and thinking like, wow, this has changed things, and this is going to make the island job, pretty exciting. And so I got over there, and it kind of became the biggest story in the world for a while because there was the Good Friday Agreement, and you had this mix of of violence and politics, which always makes for great sort of news. And and in that period, I became fascinated with South Armagh. There was the Robert Nairac
Mhm.
abduction and killing in 1977. There was an active sniper unit. In fact, I think there was two sniper teams, which I'm sure we'll talk about,
Mhm.
operating with 50 caliber weapons in South Armagh. And then there was this sort of mythical, mysterious figure who's a bit more out in the sunlight these days,
Mhm.
partly I think because of Bandit Country. Thomas Slab Murphy, who was the IRA chief of staff, who was
Mhm.
running the whole outfit on the military side, and essentially the England department. So all these bombs in England, including South Key, had been conceived and made um, and planned in South Armagh. So it just seemed like an incredible story, and I was looking for the book to read about it, and there was no book. And I guess sort of the arrogance of youth. I guess at this point I was around about 30. I thought, well, so I'll write it then. And so
Mhm.
that's how Bandit Country came about. And it was actually 25 years ago.
Yeah. Wow. Yeah.
And it was recently republished. So you'll see over my shoulder is that you've got one of the original versions, but
Mm.
I've got one of the new
Mhm.
republished versions just a few months ago. So it was fantastic to get it back out in print and have a sort of a second life, really.
Yeah, it's a fantastic book. The actually when I posted on social media I was going to interview you, a guy I know in Ireland who was in the Irish Army with me, he sent me a message and he said I gave it to somebody he knew in America and they're like they almost needed a translator. He's like they were very confused about what a lorry was.
Yeah,
But I've actually met Slab Murphy, not really met him. I remember getting called out there because when I um, basically went through basic training in Ireland, and I was stationed in a dog. We did border patrol, and we were in and out of that northern Hackballs Cross and all that area of the southern part of South Armagh. That was our patrol area, and I remember getting called out there because his farm was half in the north of Ireland, northern and half in the south, right?
yeah.
So his farm was cut in two by two different countries, basically, and that's why he was a big smuggler. But I remember getting called out there and sitting in a ditch at like 18 with my FNFAL, and he came walking down, and he's a big man, and he looked like a fucking psycho. And I was like, "Good lord, I hope I don't have to shoot this guy because he'll just piss him off if I do," you know.
Yeah,
And what? Why? Like the IRA were heavily infiltrated by the British intelligence by the end, and there's a lot more information coming out now.
yeah,
But the that active service unit in South Armagh, I think they were infiltrated right at the end, but pretty much the whole way through, they never. It was a very difficult place for the British intelligence or British Army or you see to infiltrate, and that's where the name Bandit Country comes from. Can you talk about the culture in that area, the terrain, and what it was like for British soldiers? Because I know you've interviewed British soldiers,
oh yeah,
you've talked to IRA members in that area. Can you talk a little bit about the culture, the terrain, and why they were so effective in that area?
yeah. So it's a place of South Armagh, and when I say South Armagh, I also kind of include North Louth in there as well,
Mm.
because although the border runs through it runs through the Murphy farm. It's sort of an artificial border, and in fact, there's a kind of a good thing in a book I think about the Boundary Commission in the 1920s, where if they just drawn the line in a little bit of a different place, and South Armagh really should have been in the South of Ireland because it's overwhelmingly Catholic.
Yeah.
And so going back centuries, there will be highwaymen ambushed and little castles, outposts attacked, and also just a culture of refusal to accept authority. Whatever authority that was. So a kind of a lawlessness. Um, and so when the Troubles came along, and it's rural. There's lots of sort of rocky peaks and hills and uh, and very few roads. Um, and 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 so it's sort of populated by people who've worked that land, their families for centuries. And so it's that classic sort of rural um, terrain where the locals know every inch and they know every person. And
Mm.
so one of the reasons, I mean, you write about the infiltration. I mean, I'm sure there were individual infiltrations throughout the Troubles, but nothing like, say, Derry, for instance,
Yeah.
where the IRA was basically shut down,
Hmm.
or East Tyrone, or
Yeah.
Belfast, where
Hmm.
we could both of us probably name half a dozen sort of infamous informers.
Hmm.
In South Armagh, very, very, very few, and I think it was principally because the IRA was sort of a family affair. It was six or eight families interlinked by marriage, and so to break into it wasn't just this wasn't just a job. The IRA wasn't just a job. It was a sort of a life, a
Mm.
calling, and so to betrayal, the sort of price of betrayal in that situation is very, very high, sort of morally and practically. And it's just very, very hard to get in there. And so, I mean, Robert Nyrak found that out, that he
Mm.
went into the Three Steps bar in 1977 and tried to
Yeah.
sort of bullshit a bit and sing Irish songs and say that
Hmm.
he knew a sticky in Belfast, and that kind of stuff doesn't
Yeah.
work. They know
No.
if you're if you're from the village, the next village, never
Mm.
mind, an
Yeah.
English public school boy as he was. I was very conscious of that as well. That whenever I went down, don't pretend to be anything you're not, because they'll rumble you straight away, and just sort of be straightforward.
Mm.
I mean, I heard a story, it's in the book, about a Scottish folk singer who was over there, completely innocent, had nothing to do with anything.
Mm.
But he was acting a bit weird, and maybe he was asking too many questions or something, and he was taken up to Slieve Gullion, which is the highest peak, and given an interview, and he was okay, because he wasn't involved, he wasn't a spy or anything like that. But can you
Hmm.
imagine I mean, the fear in that guy?
Yeah.
And I never wanted to be in that situation.
Hell, no, because they err on the side of caution a lot, right? If they had a guy who they thought was an informer or a British agent, they'd interrogate him and then they'd just shoot him to be on the safe side. Like, and for you to go into South Armagh and start asking questions, I was like, damn, the balls on this guy. That's a pretty dangerous thing to do, because you were there 98, was it? Yeah,
Well, 96.
yeah. Because the peace treaty was on and off for years, and it was still
Yeah.
very much an active war at that point, right?
Oh,
Because
yeah.
the peace treaty started and then it fell apart, and then, which peace treaties often do. Um, so you still had very paranoid people.
So when I got there, so I got there in March 1996. So the ceasefire ended the month before, and the second ceasefire was called in, I believe, July 97. And I went down to Crossmaglen that night. That was kind of a wild night. And so there's sort of two things. So first of all, for that initial period, there's no ceasefire on. The war's on. Both sides are doing what they have to do. Albeit the IRA really had been compromised in a way by the political leadership, and they hadn't. The ceasefire had been called, so all these things that they couldn't do, and then it was back on. But Adams and McGuinness wanted to be in talks, so it wasn't like full on like the 70s and 80s. But then
Hmm.
you also had, you know, at best a suspicion about the ceasefire, and at worst a kind of outright opposition to it in South Armagh. They were not on board. Many people felt that the Belfast leadership had sort of sold them out, and
Hmm.
so they wanted to continue, prepare for the end of this ceasefire, or continue doing their stuff, doing dummy runs, doing surveillance,
Mm.
doing planning. So yes, it was not benign environment. And, I mean, in some ways, it was a case of ignorance is bliss. It was, early 30s, and, you think you're going to live forever, and,
Hmm.
you just need to get there and go and do it. But also, I did think about it pretty carefully, that how I was going to operate, which was to be straightforward, to say who I was, never pretend to be anything else. And what I was doing was upfront. I'm a newspaper reporter. Um, I'm writing a book about South Armagh. I concentrated very much initially on the history, and going to historical commemorations and panels and stuff like that, which was a good kind of neutral ground. I
Hmm.
didn't, you can't. It's a secret organization, and you can't just go in there and say, so, what are the
Mm.
IRA up to then? Or even what did the IRA do? Or even, what did you do? You had to
Yeah.
kind of do it like elliptically, sort of go around the side.
Mm.
And so I guess I built up some sort of, and they would never have chosen me to tell that story, but I was the person that was there, and I
Mm.
felt that on the Republican side, they felt that it'd be very sort of urban centric, Belfast, Derry, Adams, McGuinness, and South Armagh that being the, sort of the engine room of the IRA really wasn't getting its due. So I tapped into that a little bit. But I always had a plan to leave immediately.
Mm-hmm.
Um, I um, I never allowed myself to get completely comfortable.
Mm.
So I was always, ready to leave, knew where the car was, and if
Yeah.
it started going pear-shaped, then I would have just walked
Mm.
out. So that's kind of how I approached it.
I was in when I was a contractor in Somalia. I was with some SAS retired SAS guys, and there was one guy who had fought in the Falklands. Big, he was a Royal Marine Commando and fought in the Falklands, and he was in 14th Inch Group in Northern Ireland. And
Oh
he
yeah,
said, and this guy was a tough guy, and he said going into an IRA pub is the scariest thing he ever did in his life, you know. And like Robert Nyrak got, which we talk about in a minute, he got completely cocky and ridiculously brave. There's a fine line between brave and stupid. And like if you'd have
we
went
try not to
into
cross it.
yeah, if you'd have went into IRA pubs and got a little hammered and said the wrong thing, then you would not be here today because and it's very Ireland is in America, the accents in America are not like you have a southern accent, and you have a Boston accent, but they're hundreds and hundreds and hundreds of miles apart. Like where I grew up, you go 6 miles up the road, and it's almost hard to understand what people are saying. And the accents are very like people even now can hear me talk and go, "Oh, you have a Dundalk accent, right?" And you've seen that when you're over there. Like the accents not even county to county, but slightly, they're very, very varied because, and people can tell as soon as you start talking, you're from Drogheda or Dundalk or Belfast, or it's quite easy to figure out. So for Robert Nyrak to go in and fake an accent, and I mean the guy was brave, right? Can you tell that story about Robert Nyrak real quick for people who
Yeah,
don't know?
sure. And just on that, so I think what another kind of advantage I had in a way was that I'd grown up in Manchester, so there's a big sort of Irish population. But this thing about accents, I mean, I used to be able to tell what part of Manchester people were from,
Really?
whether you're from
Yeah.
North Manchester or South.
Mm-hmm.
So I guess I understood
Mm.
um that 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 kind of nuance where you weren't going to be able to pass yourself off as something
Mm.
else. And so Robert Nyrak was a Grenadier Guards officer. He'd been to Ampleforth, big Catholic public school. He was a Catholic himself. He'd been to Oxford. Um, and so he met its end in 1977. So relatively early on in the Troubles, but so he'd been in 14 int in Belfast, but
Mm.
the job he
What
had
I'm sorry, Toby. What is that the equivalent of in the U.S. military,
probably
if there is such a thing?
what I'm trying to think what you're supposed to call it, orange.
Orange, yeah, that's what. Yeah, Task Force Orange, right?
So
Um,
surveillance, undercover
yeah,
surveillance. Yeah.
yep. Okay, that's just for the American audience. They don't know what 14th Int Group is. A lot of people don't.
Yeah, and it's subsequently become SSR, so
Okay.
I think
Mm.
Strategic Surveillance Regiment or something,
Yeah.
but it's been known as the Det 14
Yeah.
Int.
Hmm.
And
So it's love is intelligence, right? It's civilian clothes,
yeah,
civilian core, that type of thing. Okay. Yep.
yes. But some people say that Naira was in the SAS. He was not in the SAS. His actual job title was SAS Liaison Officer. So
Okay.
he was working for the brigade,
Mm.
the British Army Brigade, so the Green Army, sort of out on the ground, out of
Mm.
Bessbrook Mill, and he was liaising with the SAS, who'd been brought in a couple of years earlier into South Armagh amid great fanfare, and that was the time actually when Merlin Rees, the British Northern Ireland Secretary, had used the term Bandit Country, and that's
Right.
that's what
Hmm.
had stuck. And so he, I mean, he's sort of interesting character. He had some sympathies for Irish Republicans. Maybe the Catholic background sort of played into that a little bit, and he was very sort of ambitious. So he didn't want to just be a liaison officer. So there was a little bit of wannabe
Mm,
element to this, because this is a guy who had no reason to be running agents, but I guess he was trying to recruit and run agents.
which is a dangerous game if you're not trained for it. And even if you are trained for it, it's still a very dangerous game. Like very, very tough to do.
I mean, it's sort of mind-boggling. And I beat, I went into the three steps in whatever 1997, with a sort of a friend who was a local, just for a quick sort of pint. I'm sure
Yeah.
many Englishmen have done that, and it reminded me of have you ever watched American Werewolf in London?
Mm-hmm.
And they go into this
Yeah.
sort of country pub in Yorkshire. I think it's like called the Slaughtered Lamb, and it's
Yeah.
this raucous,
Yeah.
scene. And they walk through the door, and it's just sort of silence. And somebody throws a
Yeah.
dart that hits the dartboard, and you can sort of hear. It was a bit.
Yeah.
It was a little bit like that, And I'm
Mm.
sure the locals were like, "Ah, here we go. Here's another,
Mm-hmm.
troubles tourist."
Yeah.
Um, but but Nairac, Nairac, he went. I think it was May '77. He went into the three steps. Um, Now, I actually, uh, I'd be a little bit careful about what I say here. Um, I met the person who I believe the Nairac was trying to meet that
Mm.
day, and he was a guy called uh, Seamus Murphy, like the kind of that was his true name, but the
Mm.
most like John Smith, I guess,
Yep.
for
Yep.
Irishmen.
Mm.
And his background was as a sticky, so official IRA who'd broken
Mm-hmm.
with the provisionals, sort of kind of like more left wing than the provisionals.
Mm-hmm.
And eventually they became the Workers' Party and
Yeah.
kind of more
Communists.
socialist kind
Mm.
of oriented. Um, and there'd been a big feud with the provisionals, and so they were at odds with the provisionals. So they would be more recruitable than your average IRA person. So I believe that's who he was going in to meet, and he
Mm-hmm.
and Seamus was from that area. Um, and he went. So Nairac got in there. The person he was due to meet wasn't in there, and um, and it's sort of a bit eerie because I've done similar things in that I've been in pubs in South Armagh or events in South Armagh, and I've sort of been on my own, and I think I'm just gonna sort of stick it out, and you end up having quite a lot to drink, but you sort of have to, keep your wits about you. And obviously, I was not doing what Robert Naira was doing. Um, but I think he'd done a bit of this stuff in Belfast, where it's easier in an urban
Mm-hmm.
area because there's more people around, there are
Yeah.
more incomers and strangers. But no way could you do that in South Armagh. So he
Mm-hmm.
was he was singing Irish songs. I mean, it's kind of comical and tragic at the same time.
Mm.
Um, and not surprisingly, um, people started asking who the hell he was.
Mm-hmm.
And before he knew it, somebody, said, "All right, out in the parking lot now, let's, we want to talk about this." And so he goes out, and Narak being a boxer at university, and he was a fit young guy, and I'm sure he got a few punches in and stuff, but he was overwhelmed of four or
Mm-hmm.
five people. Now it wasn't an IRA operation. It was a
Mm-hmm.
bunch of, in fact, the guys who initially kind of subdued him and bundled him into the car were probably kind of what you would call IRA associates. They
Yeah.
were from they
We
were
call
from the
them
area.
barstool terrorists.
Yeah,
Yeah.
I wouldn't. They wouldn't. There's a
They're auxiliary. They were support guys.
that's
Yeah.
right. They
Mm-hmm.
wouldn't have done the like the mafia. The initiation. They weren't made
Mm-hmm.
men. Put it that way.
Yeah. Yeah.
Um,
I think the IRA were pretty. I'm sorry. I think the IRA were pretty pissed off that these guys killed him because they wanted to interrogate him. Right? Did I read that? Maybe in your book.
yeah,
Yeah.
the whole thing was a mess
Mm.
on both sides. And so they did call an IRA guy, Liam Townsend, who was later convicted of it in the South. I think he was drunk, um, and he gets over there, and so they take him across the border into Ravensdale
Yeah.
in the south in County Louth,
Mm-hmm.
and there's the Ravensdale Bridge, and so he sort of interrogation is too grand a term really, but he gets sort of questioned.
Mm.
Um, doesn't really say much. He starts praying and stuff, and the shit gets kicked out of him. I mean, there's blood and teeth and stuff left there on the bridge, and just disappears. And he is actually now known as one of the disappeared
Yeah.
bodies never been found.
Mm-hmm.
I'm I believe it's, I kind of lay out the case for it in Bandit Country. The body was disposed of in the Anglo-Irish meat plant in Ravensdale.
So as a kid, Toby, that's what I heard. When this happened, as a kid, very close to the border, the word that was said was he was put into a meat grinder in Ravensdale. Now, I don't know how that would spread around, but
Yeah.
it's funny, like you say that, because we've not talked about that you believe that's what happens. That's what I heard as a kid.
Yeah.
That was the word on the street, basically, that's what happened, which is probably true.
Well, it makes sense. The body's never been found.
Yeah.
Also, you've had a kind of a fuck up, really. Um, as you say, I'm sure the IRA would have liked to have interrogated him because he would have
Mm-hmm.
known everything about SAS operations in South Armagh, everything about military operations in the sort of the whole of the county. He would have known about 14 Int in Belfast. He would have known a lot
Yeah.
of stuff.
Mm-hmm.
Um, Also, it was very, very bad publicity,
Yep.
and even in you know mid to late '70s, the provisional movement, it had a sort of a political wing and a political
Mm.
agenda, and they didn't want to be seen by the Brits as sort of psychopaths and
Mm-hmm.
brutal sort of killers. And so it was just a bad thing all around. And so if you think about it from their point of view, they've got the authorities in the south and in the north. They've got all the newspapers. They've got public opinion, and they've got a body. You know what? Well, what do? You have to do something with it, bury it, get it out, which probably would have been risky because you'd have had to cross checkpoints and stuff. So it just makes sense. Occam's razor was the most likely thing. And there's evidence that meat plant, had connections with the provisionals.
Mm.
Um, and so yeah, and but it's
Yeah.
it's funny. I mean, there's a big, I think, going on at the moment where there was big fanfare. It was in the news that they'd had information. Maybe this was where Nirac was, and so they've been digging for the body,
Mm.
for
Is he
years.
one of the? He's one of the only disappeared that has not been found, right? Because they found a bunch of the people that were disappeared.
So Jean McConville's the most famous one now
Mm.
because she was in the book Say Nothing, which now a series. I read the other day that there were 15 disappeared and 13 of them have been found.
Right. Yeah. I
And
think there
actually,
was
I was
something like
there
that.
in uh, in '99, and there was one found at Fockett was the name of the townland.
Mm-hmm.
That had been put in a bog in like 1973, and so yeah. So
Mm. Yeah.
and in the
Yeah.
intervening 25 years, a whole bunch of them have been found.
Yeah.
Jean
The
McConville was
reason
found.
Gene McConnell was found in the South too. Yep.
Yeah, yeah,
Yep.
yeah.
Yeah.
Carlinsford.
The Carlingford again. Yeah. Carlingford and Ravensdale are pretty close to each other.
Yeah,
The um, you talk about the terrain in South Armagh, and the roads are tiny, like the big hedgerows on both sides, so you're channelized, and the roads are tiny. And when you have less roads, like Afghanistan, you have to drive on those roads. So those culvert bombs that were underneath those little bridges, they decimated the British early on, and that's why they went to helicopter movement only. And then
oh yeah, the British were channeled wherever they moved. They were channeled. So
Mhm.
the IRA controlled the terrain, they controlled the roads, and yes, as you say, eventually they went to helicopters.
Yeah, when you're a conventional army, and I'm saying this to students at Robin Sage for when you're a conventional army, you have standard procedures, standard operating procedures, SOPs, and which makes you super predictable for people who just sit there and drink beer and figure out how to attack you, right? So I put an IED in here, and I sit back and I watch where you put your cord on, how you approach it, all your everything you put into place, and then the next time I'm waiting for you to, and that happened in Warren Point, right? They had the IRA looked at Warren Point and they said, okay, if we put a bomb here, they're probably going to set up like a control point here.
Yeah,
And so we talk about that in a second. I did a course in the Irish Army when I was in the infantry, and it was looking for IEDs and sweeping railway lines and sweeping derelict houses for weapons caches and going in and looking for trip wires and booby traps. And it showed us how to make all mercury tilt switches and all that stuff and ammonium nitrate and fuel. So we'd know what to look for and what it smells like and all that. But we did one training exercise one time, and they had a derelict house, and we were supposed to come in, set up a control point, cordon it off. We do this sweep around it with these buried wire detectors that like electricians use or whatever, and to find command wires. And then we do sweep it with metal detectors and then the whole procedures. But we pulled in all our Land Rovers at this training exercise, and we got out to set up our control point, and somebody hit a tripwire. And it's the exact same thing because they step back and go, they're going to go here. So these standard procedures make you very, very predictable. And for a terrorist, freedom fighter, insurgent, whatever fuck you want to call it, that makes them very effective. And that's what happened to Warren Point. Can you talk to Warren Point for me real quick?
Yeah, absolutely. And so part of this is, and this happened in Afghanistan as well. So
Mm-hmm.
the Brits come in. I mean, I think in the 70s they'd have what's called emergency tours. Actually, it's a pretty good book about South Armagh, which was written by a brigadier who was, I think, battalion commander there in mid 70s, called Emergency Tour. 3 months. What can you do in 3 months?
Yeah, yeah,
And then
yeah.
and then it moved to six. Sometimes it would be 6 months or a year, but even in that,
Mm-hmm.
even in that sort of period, you go to South Armagh, your mindset is you just want to survive. For
Yeah,
your unit, you just want to bring everybody back, or only lose a handful maybe. Um, and the IRA's there all the time.
yeah. It their day job. Yep.
Yeah, and the Brits are coming in and sort of like reinventing the wheel every time, and
Mm-hmm.
the military mentality. The battalion commander's sort of gung ho. He wants to sort of do an operation. He
Yeah.
wants to arrest
Mm-hmm.
people. He wants to kind of, get his OBE or his, DSO or whatever it is. And I'm not denigrating it. I mean, it's understandable. It's the way the military operates. But then you've got the locals who are just sort of sitting back and they've sort of seen it all before.
Mm-hmm.
And so with Warren Point, so I always call it narrow water because it was at narrow water castle. Um, but basically, I think you'd had bombs going off there before, and the IRA was very, very good at intelligence gathering and surveillance and just sort of watching. And so these were
Yeah.
farmers
Patterns
who,
patterns of life. They're documenting patterns of behavior. Yeah.
so these, the South Armagh people, you underestimate them at your peril, and sometimes the British did. Not, formally educated people, but
Mm-hmm.
clever
Clever.
people with
Mm-hmm.
sort of guile and wily, and they sort of knew what's what, and they knew their environment. So they'd seen the way the Brits had responded to bombs narrow water before, and so the way they set it up was they worked out exactly where, according to the British Army SOPs, the incident control point would be, which was at a
Mm-hmm.
gatehouse. And so they um, they wanted to target. I'm told they wanted to target Royal Marines, but actually ended up being a parachute regiment convoy. And this is August 1979.
Yeah.
And so they had a big trailer full of hay that was left at the Narrowwater Castle itself, which is this picturesque, I think, sort of Victorian era, in fact, maybe probably before that, stone structure. Beautiful place. And so they just left this trailer there full of hay, and sure enough, underneath the hay was milk churns, I think, filled with
Mm-hmm.
explosives. And they're also using the IRA is also using the border to
Yeah.
to its advantage. So narrow water was on the north side of Carlingford Lock, which was this waterway with the border running right down the middle of it. It's the
Mm-hmm.
border between the United Kingdom and the Republic of Ireland.
Mm-hmm. I'm sure you visited that spot, right? When you were up
Oh,
there.
many
Oh
times.
yeah, it's a beautiful area.
Yeah.
It's a beautiful area. Yeah.
So apparently they're putting a bridge over Carlingford Lock now. Can't
Really.
imagine. Yeah,
There
but
was a there was a British gunboat there during the
yeah,
troubles. Yeah. Yeah.
and they would get they were hit by 50 caliber rounds a few times in the 1990s. So there'd be,
Damn. Yeah.
can you imagine if
Mm-hmm.
they'd taken out somebody on one of those little
Mm-hmm.
ships? And there were sort of friends of mine, contemporaries of mine, who were on those ships.
Mm-hmm.
Um, and so uh, uh, Joseph Brennan and Brendan Burns, who were the two IRA men, who so it was a remote controlled detonation of the trailer, which was at the castle.
Mm-hmm.
And then a couple of hundred yards away, there was another device, again in milk churns, packed into this gatehouse where the IRA had calculated the incident control point uh, would be. And so they pressed the button, and as this convoy was going past, and they blew up the tail end of the convoy, and I believe six were killed. And I think there were six in a vehicle with eight in them, like a Land Rover at the back. And I interviewed one of the guys called Tom Cockey, who was actually from Northern Ireland, who was horrendously burnt, and I remember
Mm-hmm.
being in his house and talking to him about, you know, what it was like, and he just wept. And so Burns and Brennan, so the explosion's gone off. Then they set the second device, which is on a timer. I think it was one of those they were called memo part
Yeah.
timers.
Little thing for cooking. Yeah. Mm-hmm.
Yeah, yeah, cooking or how long the parking when the parking meter
Yeah.
is going to run out. And and again, the IRA was very good at improvising,
Mm-hmm.
improvised explosive devices, using sort of common, electrical like gadgets and things. And then over
Yeah.
here, stuff from Radio Shack, um,
Mm-hmm.
and using those in their devices. And so they timed it for 30 minutes. Um, and sure enough, helicopter comes in, um, and the commanding officer, I think it was the Queen's Own Hussars, and it was Lieutenant Colonel David Blair, who was the outgoing sort of battalion commander, and also coincidentally was a key witness with a top IRA man, Patsy O'Callaghan, who died a couple of years ago. Um, Patsy O'Callaghan probably would have gone away. Then the main witness was just fortuitously killed in this. So there was a lieutenant colonel, a major, Fursman, um, and I think another. Well, I think it was 18 were killed in total. So another 12 were killed
Mm-hmm.
when that device detonated using the timer
Yeah.
30 minutes later. And Burns and Brennan were arrested. They by the guards. They'd escaped on a motorbike, but they were nowhere near the place when the
Mm-hmm.
second explosion happened. And
Mm-hmm.
so, you know, it. I mean, for the parachute regiment, um, to lose 18, not all of them were paras, but the vast number of those were paras. And it was, for
Mm-hmm.
the IRA, it was payback for bloody Sunday. And that
Exactly.
same
Yeah.
day, that same day, Lord Mountbatten was killed
Right.
in County Sligo, and that
Yeah.
was also a South Armagh operation.
Yeah. The like I was a kid when Narrow Water went off, and I heard the bomb go off. Me and my old man were up hunting. I was telling you this, and we heard the boom, the explosion, because it traveled across the waterway, right? Because it's on kind of on the coast, and I was down in the south. And as soon as that bomb went off, my old man was like, "That's a bomb in Northern Ireland," like that. And it was probably the second bomb. But I knew a guy who lived in Newry, which is in the north. After that, he was a kid, and he said British soldiers come up with tears in their eyes, and they'd be fucking slapping the kids because they're like, "Oh, it's bad enough to be killing soldiers, but when you start killing royalty, like that hit the British government hard because he was like the viceroy of India and all that kind of thing, you know."
No, it's like a
Um,
relative of the royal. Yeah, right. Yeah, it's like
yeah, like yeah,
Prince Charles's favorite uncle and stuff.
yeah, yeah. So
No, and I remember, my father. I remember it was the first time I'd ever heard him swear, I think, So I
mm,
was 13. I remember him saying, I just remember him coming upstairs and telling me about Mountbatten. He just said, bastards,
mm-hmm, yeah.
and that sort of wasn't the way he was. And so it was raw. Yeah.
Yeah, I knew a guy who lived in Omeath, which is on the southern part there where Narrowwater is, and he ended up in the army with me. But he said that there was parts of rifles in backyards and arms with watches on them, and like if you've ever been around a big explosion like that, if you've never been in one, it's very hard to describe. It is devastating, and what it does to the human body is it's very very difficult to describe, and that was a massive bomb.
No,
Um,
so I mean, I've seen that myself um in Iraq, um, and I particularly remember one. It was a Hamas guy. The Israelis had killed a Hamas guy, um, Sheikh. Yassine, I think, which would have been about must have been about 2004 time, and he was a guy in a wheelchair, Hamas commander, and in Gaza, and so I was based in Jerusalem at that time, and yeah, I remember getting down there, and there's bits of flesh hanging from the trees,
Yeah, it's
and
shocking.
that's just a
Yeah,
small bomb with one guy, and
yeah.
and people described some of the people who were involved in the cleanup. You can just imagine the sort of you know this the PTSD kind of thing from
Hmm.
this on your mind years and years later. Yeah, picking
Yeah,
up fingers
yeah. Yeah.
and
The
stuff.
the
And
so the bomb for Narrow Water was in the north, and then the command wire to detonate it ran through the lake and into the south, and it was detonated from the south. I we
well,
got
I don't
called.
think it was a command wire. I think it was. I'd have to check the book. I
Mm,
think it was radio controlled.
oh, was it? Okay. Yeah,
I
but it
think it
was.
just would have been too far for a command wire. And
Yeah, it would have been. Yeah. But we got called out there when I was on border patrol duty there. We got called out to that spot again because I don't know if the Brits reported or some suspicious activity. So we hit that with the Gardaí, the police, and then we swept that whole area, and we didn't find anything, But I got to stand right there where they think they detonated. As I'm sure you did. I'm sure you went there to look at it from that side. Um,
yeah, they found
Devast-
cigarette butts there
yeah.
and
Mm-hmm.
stuff. And I think they've been
Yeah.
waiting there for quite a while.
Yeah, I mean a devastating attack on that. So, did the British Army have any successes, like big successes in South Armagh in those early years?
Well, they had some. So, individual. So like I remember Seamus Harvey was an IRA man who was killed by the SAS, for instance,
Mm-hmm.
and uh, future General Michael Rose was the commander. So I guess they would judge that as a success. I mean,
Yeah,
strategically, one IRA man, not really. But there wasn't
yeah.
anything like, say, in East Tyrone, like Loch Gore,
No.
where you had sort of whatever it was, 8 IRA
Mm-hmm.
men killed in one go. And so the number of arrests and convictions over the years in South Armagh was you know relative to the size of the IRA was pretty small. So you had again, it probably didn't help their influence in a way that they had like fewer people in
Yeah.
the H blocks compared to Belfast and Derry.
Mm.
But the big, I mean, I guess the biggest success they ever had came in April '97 when it was an SAS operation and
Mm.
intelligence as well, when they arrested a sniper team. So
Right.
uh,
Yeah. Um.
I think four of them, Michael Carra, sort of
Mm.
one of the two IRA sniper teams,
Mm-hmm.
um, and that was a big moment for the
Right. And
British.
there was, I don't know where I read this, or there was talk. Well, let's talk about the sniper teams later on because that's a big part of
Yeah.
this area story. So we talked Iraq, we talked Narrow Water. What I'm trying to remember what other operations that were big. Um, yep.
There was a lot of stuff like sort of right on the border. Well, so you have a whole. I mean, beauty of the subject for me was it was like all roads led to South Armagh. So informers were dealt with it in South Armagh. So
Mm,
what's being become known as the Nutting Squad or
yeah.
whatever, and
Steak knife.
Fred Scappaticci, known
Yeah.
as Steak Knife, who was not a South Armagh guy, was a Belfast guy, but the IRA sort of security unit would interrogate informers or suspected informers in South Armagh because it was IRA controlled territory. So you could go
Mm-hmm.
into a barn and you would have done all your you it would have so the other thing about the topography is the Brits put watchtowers across South Armagh in the mid 80s.
Mm-hmm.
So and they were called Romeo and Golf towers. And so it was very, very heavily surveilled. But because of the terrain, the IRA, you know, calculated where the dead ground was, where it couldn't be seen from the towers, and so they operated accordingly. So
Mm,
you'd have a barn, and it might be just across the border as well into the south in Louth or Monaghan, where this sort of interrogation could take place. And if the if it was an informant and the sentence was death, then they would be killed, and the body dumped on the border, often booby trapped,
Mm,
to at the very least make it sort of difficult for the British. So you had that going on. You had a bunch of uh, very high profile figures targeted driving across the border. So judges,
yeah.
so Judge Gibson, like I think he was Lord Gibson. He and his wife were killed in a as their vehicle. They've been on holiday, you know, uh,
Mm,
come back into Dublin, and they were driving north. There was another judge, Higgins. They targeted. They got the wrong car and they killed a family, the Hannah family.
wow.
Um, and I
Mm,
saw. I mean, one of the things I did as part of my kind of research was um, I looked into the coroner's files, which had photos of the autopsies and the
mm,
incident. And I just, I remember the Hannah family, sort of heartbreaking, children's
mm,
shoes and feet and stuff, and
yeah.
blown. And so there was a lot of stuff on the border, um, and you had sniper operations. You had the England
Mm,
department in from the 90s being made there. So huge bombs or huge bombs in other places in Northern Ireland. So the biggest bomb they ever set off was relatively late on. I think it would have been in the early 90s when this was this was the lengths to which they would go to avoid having one of their guys imprisoned. But there was somebody who had been arrested, and they knew that the evidence, I think it was splinters of wood,
oh, yeah,
um,
yeah.
and
Mm,
so the evidence was and they knew that the evidence was in the whatever it was, the Northern Ireland Forensic Laboratory on the outskirts of Belfast.
mm-hmm.
So the IRA in South Armagh built this massive bomb. I forget what the size of it was, the biggest bomb ever built in Northern Ireland, and they drove it up towards Belfast and set it off outside the forensic laboratory just to destroy this one piece of evidence, which
Yeah.
they didn't manage to do. And the guy was convicted. But it's kind of like
Mm,
wild, about
yeah. It's like if it was a movie, you wouldn't freaking believe it, you know? I remember being on the border in like 85, 86 when I was in the infantry, when they were building the towers and they were dug in Hackball's Cross on the south, right? One of the big towers, they were dug in and they had, I can't remember if I saw it or somebody told me, they had Milan anti-tank weapons dug in. And at the time, I didn't know why. It's like seems like a massive thing for a counterterrorism operation, but now looking back, it's probably for the mortars built into the vans, right? Which I seen one of them. It must have got captured in the south. And when I was on that course, I told you it was called SSE course, it was sensitive site exploitation or something, or SS whatever, searching for bombs and IEDs and all that. They showed it to us, and it was a van and they had it rigged up. It was already rigged up. It had been captured in the south, and the roof was a tarp on it. So from like it was a white van with a white tarp. So from a helicopter you couldn't tell, and it had all the mortars lined up, and they fired it, and the lights would go off to simulate it firing, and then they fired in a sequence where it wouldn't destabilize the van too much, and then the van would blow up once it was all done, and take away the evidence. So I think those mortars, which are big gas bottles. I think they were developed in South Armagh, or am I
oh
right
yeah.
about that? They were, yeah.
So the mortars, they went up to Mark 10, which was
Mm.
the so-called barrack busters.
Mm-hmm.
And I think it was and also it was a South Armagh design mortar that was fired at Downing Street. And so
Right.
the,
During the Gulf War, right? During the Gulf War, and it landed in the front yard or something. Yeah.
yeah. And it's funny actually, so kind of a funny thing was when I wrote Bandit Country, I wrote about that attack on Downing Street and the whole IRA development of mortars. And then the kid, well, he wasn't a kid by then, he was grown up, but kid from school called Eamon, I won't give him his last name. So Eamon, who was a total like, you know, ne'er do well at school and everything, but he'd obviously got his act together and he joined the army and he became a highly decorated bomb disposal officer, and
Wow.
he gave me a little correction on something I'd written about the
Mm,
mortars, and
yeah.
I subsequently sort of worked out that he was one of the British Army's
Mm.
foremost experts on what
Hmm.
was going on with what the IRA was doing with mortars. But yes, I think so. Marks 1 to 10 were all kind of tested and designed in South
Mm.
Armagh, and I think Mark 10 was, which was probably a British Army designation,
Yeah.
um, was known as the Barrack Buster. So
Hmm.
these massive like gas tanks.
Yeah, like I said earlier, it's actually good that you're English and you wrote this book because I feel like people are going to be like, oh, you're praising the IRA. We're not. People died. People were murdered, and we're talking about history here. We're talking about facts about things that happened in Northern Ireland, right? In a specific point, right? It's not to support the IRA or praise the IRA in any way, shape, or
No,
form.
no,
It's a very difficult, and I've done it. To operate in an environment like that, in counterterrorism for soldiers who were trained for war, it's a very difficult area to work in. And it was more difficult for the British Army in Northern Ireland because they refused to call it a war, right? So
yes.
it was police work done by soldiers with one hand tied behind their back because you needed probable cause, you needed evidence, and you're basically a police officer and you're not trained for that. And every single, if you think about this, and I'm not talking to you, I'm talking to the audience, right? But if you think about you're a police officer in anywhere in Northern Ireland and somebody calls and says, my car was stolen or my house was broken into, and they have to send a police officer out to investigate that. They have to take a platoon of soldiers with them and cordon the whole area off
And
because
insert
it's
them by helicopter.
and yes, and it's probably an ambush, but they have to respond, right?
Yeah.
And extremely difficult, you know. And then, like when they put the SAS in there, which they were always in there, but it kind of came to light in the '80s where all the shoot to kill policy and all this kind of thing, which was a ridiculous propaganda narrative from the IRA because like Loch All is a great example, right? But like, oh, they should have tried to arrest them. You've 8 people heavily armed going in to kill everybody.
I know.
No, you don't get to play that game both sides, right? You want to fight. You want to fight like this, then you're gonna pay the price when they have the upper hand, right? So you fight fire with fire, but because of the narrative that it's not a war, because for the British to admit it was a war would mean to them it was a civil war because Northern Ireland was part of the United Kingdom and they would never do that, right? So it was always this police action. I mean, the lines got very, very blurred in what was done in the name of policing, you know what I mean? Very, especially with informants and all that kind of thing. But this is not a podcast to praise the IRA. This is looking at history
Oh
and
no, absolutely not.
evaluating it.
And
Yeah.
Bandit Country wasn't either. But it's, you give your enemy on both sides their due.
Yeah.
And
Hmm.
all this stuff about, you know, the Brits are just, just want to murder everybody and all that stuff. That's propaganda. And so is shoot to kill, and the
Hmm.
watchtowers are, sending radiation in to create cancers, and that's
Yeah.
just
Yeah.
and so I think both sides kind of. I mean, I'm sure, some of the South Armagh IRA people were kind of chuckling at some of the things that were attributed to the Brits. Um,
Hmm.
and but for me, as a journalist and or sort of as a historian, it really, you want to leave all that. That's just bullshit baggage. You leave
Yeah.
that at the
Hmm.
door. Like if you go in, and you still think, well, the IRA just like, you know, psychopathic idiots. And you never,
Hmm.
that's ridiculous. And
Yeah.
no professional SAS man or British soldier would have ever thought that, because that's how you get yourself killed, by
It is.
underestimating your enemy. So you kind of have a respect
Hmm.
for the other side and the morality of it and the politics of it. That's just, to me, that just gets in the way. It's not
Hmm.
very interesting because it just becomes like slogans and what about this and what about that. Um, so I mean, one thing I've tried to do sort of throughout my work is to just cut through all that. What's
Yeah.
the
Yeah.
reality? What what
Hmm.
what actually happened?
Yeah.
And to try and be as granular as possible about it. Like,
Hmm.
so Bandit Country, I became very interested in how these bombs worked, and I drove the ground. to do to as you say, like with narrow water, like position myself where the bomb went off. I'd go around on the other side of Carlingford Lock and see where the button was. There's the famous Breen and Buchanan, who the two most senior IEC officers, the Troubles who were killed um, just near Jonesborough, coming from Dundalk Station.
Yeah.
You may know about it.
So can you
the
talk that
number
one a
of
little
times
bit?
I drove that route,
Yeah.
I would drive from Dundalk Station with a timer to work out what was possible and what wasn't, and how it would have gone down. I would drive the road from Newry, and that's how that's how you sort of understand it and how you kind of solve the puzzle.
Because there's only so many routes they could take back into Northern Ireland, right? If you're coming, and those guys do.
The IRA had covered each one of them.
Yeah,
they were going to die whichever way they went back.
Yeah, and they had an armored low-vis undercover car with them, right? And they're two senior RUC officers, right? And they came down to Dundalk to talk about border security, right? And Dundalk's my hometown, right? Yes, and I think I read it in Bandit Country. There was they figured out later on there was a phone call made by an Irish police officer to the IRA saying they were leaving, and the IRA are not going to hit them in the south because they don't want civilian casualties. They want to keep it in the north as much as possible. So as soon as they crossed into the Northern Ireland, across the Northern Ireland border, they were boxed in, and the IRA had a fucking Dishka 50 cal Russian machine gun mounted on a vehicle, and they tore the car to pieces. You'll find it interesting, Toby, real quick before you. There was a guy I know who drove into that ambush seconds before it started. And the IRA pulled his car to one side, took him out of the car, took him down into the ditch, and said, "Stay here till it's over." And they said his name. And I'm not going to say his name. Let's say John, right? It wasn't his name. Stay here till it's over, John. They knew who he was, and they wanted him to know who he was. So the ambush went in, and he got in his car and he drove away. And he was like, "I am not telling anybody anything." Yeah.
So I read some of the witness statements of those people. I think there were about 12 of them or something, and they're all like lying on the road, like on the side of the road. I mean, that was just sort of pitiful. And again, I saw there are some things you can't unsee, and one of them was I saw the SOCO scenes of crime officer, IEC photos from the Breen and Buchanan incident, which I think was it 89, if I remember.
Sounds about right. Yeah, sounds about right.
89. And so Buchanan, who I think was a superintendent, and Breen was a chief superintendent. Buchanan was the sort of more mild-mannered guy. He was very religious, and part of the issue with him was that he believed in like predestination. Whatever will be, will be.
Yeah.
Which, if you're operating militarily,
it's comforting. It's actually comforting. I was like that in Iraq and Afghanistan. I was like, well, if it's my time, it's my time. It's an easy way to get on with your job.
Sure, but you can affect the outcome by being careful about some of these things. Mm-hmm. But he was driving, and I mean, he was riddled with bullets. I mean, his head was cracked open like an eggshell, and his foot was still on the accelerator when he died. So the car kind of veers off. And then Harry Breen, the chief superintendent, I mean, he must have known what was coming. But he got out of the car and he had a white handkerchief, and he waved a white handkerchief in the air, and they just went up and shot him in the head.
Yeah.
And his brains were on the road, in the photos and stuff.
That was a South Armagh operation too?
Oh yeah, absolutely, yeah. So that was the guy who, I mean, the mastermind of that operation was the guy who in the book I couldn't name him, is the surgeon, who was the operational commander, and is still. I mean, I guess the IRA is supposed to have been disbanded, isn't it? But he's a very senior figure in the Republican movement.
Yeah. And I've said to you, like we chatted last time, had I been born 6 or 8 miles north of where I was born, I would probably be in the IRA too, because you're dealing with that, the British hitting you breed up with the culture, right? And you're radicalized from being a kid, and you deal with the Brits coming in and rolling up your dad and all that. And I've been on the other end of that. I remember hitting targets in Iraq, and we put a charge on a door one time. We blew it up, and it blew out all the windows in the street, basically. And my warrant officer was like, hey, we got to stop explosively breaching because we're radicalizing people. But for me, as the guy at the breach point, that charge buys me 10 seconds to get in. And because I'm not worried about politics at that point. I'm trying to live through the next 5 minutes of my freaking life. You know what I mean? So I do look at it from the British Army point. I try to look at everything from both points of view, you know? And kind of segueing into that, can you talk about Michael Carraher and how he got radicalized early when his cousin or something was shot by the Brits and he was shot too, and how he fed in, and we can feed that into the sniper operations because he was one of the main snipers, right?
So that was his brother. So Micheál Carraher, he I mean, he's from a famous IRA family. So I
Mm-hmm.
interviewed his father, Peter John, PJ Carraher, who's since died, who was an IRA man, you know,
Mm-hmm.
uh, and I
How,
interviewed.
I'm sorry. I'm sorry, Toby. How was he to talk to? Was he pretty open? Was he pretty? I mean, what was his attitude when you were talking to him? I'm just interested.
I mean, so I sat in his kitchen,
Yeah.
and I subsequently found out that in that kitchen, through this was through Burnham McGinn, who was on the sniper team, and he did a full confession before, and
Mm.
he then recanted it. But he talked about an IRA plot to bomb Birmingham, which was
Yeah.
discussed at that kitchen table. I didn't know that at the time.
Wow. Mission planning.
It was
Yeah.
kind of, I mean, it was sort of, it was, it was a little bit surreal going into some of these houses,
Mm.
and I sometimes I had the feeling of, um, I am who I am. Uh, I'm straight up about what I'm doing, but I sometimes had a feeling, well, if I were you, I wouldn't really be inviting me in here.
Like to you, you're not your cover, but your backstory. You're a reporter. You're writing a book. That's a cover that the CIA and MI6 have used repeatedly over the years. You know.
The CIA, there's a lot. I know a lot about CIA these days, but there's a lot of rules about the CIA with people they can't use. Peace Corps,
Mm.
um, NGOs now since the Bin Laden thing, journalists. But yes, back in the day, they used to
Mm.
have journal. It was cover. There were CIA officers. It was like CBS. I was reading a memoir from a guy who was, he was a CIA officer who was placed into CBS as a CBS journalist. So yes, it
Wow.
was cover.
Yeah.
And
Hmm.
so yeah, I mean, also at the same time, it was kind of weird because I was speaking to and some of them were kind of good friends, like British military intelligence officers.
Hmm.
So Rupert Thornlow, who was killed in Helmand in 2009, he was doing Robert Nairak's old job, essentially. He was the
Mm.
liaison officer, wasn't just special forces, but he was liaising with IEC, Special Branch,
Hmm.
MI5, and to an extent the guards as well. But I was, and I know how much they wanted information about the Caraher family and other people that I was seeing, and
Hmm.
also what they would have done to have been to get a listening device, you know,
Yeah.
under the kitchen table. And
Did they frisk you when you went in there? Did Carraher, like, did they frisk you when
no,
you went in
nobody
there?
ever frisked. No, no.
Yeah.
I mean,
Wow.
in a way, I'd have felt better if they had done,
Yeah.
because
Yeah.
again, there's this weird feeling of they're sort of trusting me in some ways too much, and and you know anyway. So yeah, he was pretty wary, but so basically, to go back to what you mentioned, um Mihal uh and his brother Fergal. So I forget how many brothers there were, but I think there's a picture in Bandit Country of
Hmm.
Peter John and the kids standing on the border, and like sort of
Right.
three of them are on the border, three of them are in the south and four of them are in the north, something like that. And
Yeah.
Fergal
Yeah.
and Mihal are in that picture.
Hmm.
Um, now Fergal was an IRA volunteer,
Hmm.
um, and Mihal was an IRA volunteer, and but two Royal Marines. There was a checkpoint. They ran a checkpoint. Obviously, the Marines knew who the Carahers were, and it went wrong. Whatever, um, and they ended up. The Marines ended up opening fire on the Caraher vehicle, and they killed Fergal, and they wounded Mihal. And so, they were already in the IRA. Now, it was interesting that Peter John Caraher, you know, very proud of his IRA lineage, but it's a secret organization. But when somebody's killed, usually they're identified as a volunteer. There's an IRA funeral. They're on the roll of honor. But for propaganda reasons, um, it suited the Republican movement more to have Mihal as a Sinn Féin member, as an
Because it looked like just a killing. It looked like they had no guns. They just figured that these guys are IRA and we're just going to shoot them, and say they drove to the checkpoint, which has happened in Northern Ireland.
so I don't know at this point. I'd have to go back into it exactly what happened. But yes, they were. It appears that they weren't armed. Now, as we've kind of discussed, the soldiers, Marines, they want to live. They're shit scared.
Mm-hmm.
Um, they know that these guys are IRA men, and so in that sort of environment, things can go wrong. I think it's extremely unlikely. It doesn't really make sense that they would deliberately target, you
Mm-hmm.
know, and kill people who were unarmed, even if only for practical reasons. When that happens, you talk about this being a sort of a police operation rather than a war. I
Yeah.
mean, British soldiers have gone to prison, like so Fisher and Wright, the two Scots guardsmen who shot a guy that they believed had a coffee jar bomb in Belfast. You know, they were convicted of murder and went to prison. So
Mm-hmm.
that's never, leaving aside the morality of it. I think no British soldier wants to go through that. So
Yeah.
uh, anyway, but obviously it was foundational for Mihal and for the Caraher family, and I think it was Michael Mansfield's sort of QC. They did. It was a big. They made it into a big international
Mm-hmm.
sort of you know dog and pony show where they had all these Mansfield and all these kind of left wing you know legal figures coming over and doing a trial with all the locals giving evidence and obviously the
Yeah.
British having nothing to do with it.
The IRA were good at propaganda. They were
Yeah,
very good at propaganda. Yep. Which is an important piece of this, right? Um, the
from this, I mean, Mihal and Fergal were sort of young guys, and clearly that's a pivotal moment in anybody's life. Your brother getting killed,
mm-hmm.
beside you, and so and Mihal became one of the snipers. So
Mm-hmm.
he was obviously a good marksman. Um, we know through McGinn's testimony, um, or McGinn's police interviews, uh, that Mihal was the one who pulled the trigger. For instance, there was a shot taken. One of the very few people who've been hit by a 50 caliber round had survived. Constable Ronnie Galway, who actually met in Belfast a couple of years ago. Well, I interviewed him for the book, but I met him again, and he's doing pretty well. But Mihal fired the shot like lying on a dog kennel
Mm-hmm.
in the backyard of house opposite Forkhill IEC and an army base. And as the Welsh Guards came out with a couple of IEC men, and Ronnie was hit. It hit his Maglite torch
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
flashlight, which was on his thigh, and that probably just took enough of the velocity off it to save his life. But the bullet went through his thigh, 50 caliber round.
Wow. Yeah, 670 grains. Like that's a massive bullet with a lot of energy. How he lived is pretty impressive. How many
But
people?
Stephen Restrick, Lance Bombardier, who was the last British soldier to be killed in the Troubles. That was Mihal Caraher. That was outside Bestbrook Mill.
Yeah, he was at a checkpoint, right? And he was the woman he was talking to. She actually went to his funeral.
a crack at the side of the car. The soldier was just handing me back my licence when it happened. He was smiling at me. And there was just a crack and a flash. And the next thing I knew, there was just blood pouring from my head, and the soldier, could hear him groaning on the ground. I wanted to help him, but I couldn't do anything. I don't know anything, first aid or anything. There was nothing I could do. And my heart just goes out to him. You know, I just feel so very, very sorry for them. I was in the ambulance with him. And he's just a young man, you know.
And then, and did a lot of interviews, and she was a relative. She was called Lorraine McElroy. And I remember interviewing her, and she was eloquently denounced the IRA, and did a bunch of interviews. And she was a relative of Donna Maguire, who was an IRA member who'd been convicted of stuff on the continent. And all of a sudden, Lorraine McElroy went completely quiet, and I believe left the area. So
yeah, they don't like that. They don't. Yeah, they frown on that. How many British soldiers were shot by snipers because there were two sniper teams, right, in South Armagh?
And so I'd have to go back to the numbers, but I believe it was 8 or 10, and it was
Okay.
RUC men and soldiers.
Right.
And it was over a period from like the early 90s through to 97 was the last one.
Right, and there's a picture in the book, but the IRA put up the sniper at work signs, which looked like a yield sign in America, and it showed a silhouette of a sniper. And again, it's propaganda, right?
But it was incredibly effective. So in that period in the 90s, and when I was there, British soldiers and IC officers were absolutely terrified. So if you think about it, the IRA had already controlled the roads, and you've got helicopters coming in and out, and obviously they're trying very hard to bring a helicopter down. Then you had this, and a lot of it was sort of myth and propaganda, because so first of all, they didn't use 50. They had two Barrett 90 bolt action rifles, 50 caliber. But they also used but the sniper teams also used 7.62 millimeter rounds as well. So it wasn't all 50 calibers.
Okay.
And also the range was relatively, for weapons like that, close in. Like I think 250 yards was kind of the maximum. But the sort of the myth, and the British media lapped this up. I don't think I was included, but about the sniper being a sort of a Superman trained by US Special Forces who's shooting from more than a mile away. And this gets, and this is in the Sun and the Mirror and the Express, and it gets in the head of the British soldiers, and they're terrified. And then these signs go up that a sniper at work, like a British road sign. And so you can imagine, and then again, that's all over the media. And so you can imagine the psychological effect that has on a young British soldier. It's sort of genius in a way. And I asked Pat Thompson, who's an IRA man who had been convicted of murdering 4 British soldiers. He'd done like 15 years in prison, and so I interviewed him for Bandit Country, and I asked him about the signs. I said, who came up with the idea for the signs? And he says, I don't know, but it fair caught the fucking imagination, didn't it?
Yeah.
And he just sort of smiles, So you can just imagine again, like some guy in a farmhouse saying, you know what? How about this?
And as you think about as a RUC officer, a British soldier patrolling, now you're looking for IDs, and you don't know if you're in the crosshairs of a fucking 50 cal, which you're not going to survive if it hits you fucking, except for that one guy anywhere. I've done counter sniper operations in Mosul back in like 05, 06, 05, I think, when I was in Special Forces in the American military. So, and it's and they were shooting from cars the same way they did in Northern Ireland, right? They pull up in a car and you're hiding in the open, right? Everybody talks about counter sniper stuff, and they think about enemy at the gates, look for curtains moving and all. There's a fucking million people in Mosul, and they would pull up, shoot from a car, and drive away, and it was almost impossible to catch them. We were on a counter sniper op one time. I think I've probably told the story before. We were on a counter sniper op one time, and we had Iraqis with us, and we were working with the regular army. And we had all our Iraqis in civilian cars, but we had camo with them, and we had our guys dressed as US infantry in the back of Strikers. And the Striker, the hatch opens at the back, and you can stand up on it. And they were coming back in the gate after the whole thing was over, and the army guy next to our guy was like, "Oh, my weapon fired," because he felt it, and then he looked and the dust cover was closed, and it didn't fire. It was the bullet from the sniper hit his weapon in the back of the vehicle while he's driving back in the gate on a counter sniper op. So it's extremely hard to catch these guys in the act. The best way to catch them is to put a massive reward out there and go roll them up while they're sleeping.
So what they did, and so when they had the sniper arrests at the Craig and Duff farm in April '97, the SAS sort of went in and arrested them. So they found the vehicle, and it was a Mazda, and they had this huge steel plate that was fitted into the back of the vehicle with a little aperture in it, and so this sniper, Karaha in this case, would lie on his stomach with the barrel of the weapon through this little hole in this plate, and it even had a little cover on it. And so basically, it was one shot, bolt action, and so what you had to do was get the car in place, open the back hatch, and that was on a string, and fire the round, pull the string, close the hatch, the aperture's closed, and then you just drive away. And if the British are on the ball, I can see where the firing point was and can fire at you. It's just going to hit this. It's just going to hit the steel plate.
Yeah.
And that's what they did. And they learned. So there was a case with in Crossmaglen Square with some Grenadier Guards in the 70s, where I think 3 or 4 of them had been killed with a similar thing. There was a big steel plate, and it was in a truck with loads of cardboard boxes in front of it. And so these Grenadier Guards were on patrol, and then these rounds were fired, and then the truck drives off, and the steel plate is there. So again, these things were not sort of new or accidental. They were sort of developed over many years. And the Washington DC snipers, do you remember in about 2002?
Yep.
So that's how they operated. And in fact,
Yeah.
Bandit Country was used in the trial of one of them as
Really?
as an exhibit of about whether this is terrorism or not. And so it's sort of, when you think about it, it makes absolute sense. But it's only, I don't know, for the likes of me anyway, that once they do it, you think, oh, well, that's so obvious. But it's still sort of not obvious before you've done it. It's very clever.
Yeah, it's very clever, and it's very hard to spot when they're intermixed with all the locals. So talk about how they got rolled up, because I don't know if I read it in the book or I heard it since, that they were kind of sacrificed for the peace treaty, and I don't know if that's true or not. But can you talk about how they got arrested and rolled up by the SAS?
Yes. So I now believe there was an informant involved. I am pretty sure. Actually, I know that there were listening devices at the farm, and so it was a very deliberate and planned arrest operation. Now, again, if you think about if this had been a few years earlier in a different environment, the SAS could have just they could have waited until they picked up weapons to go off on the shoot and just killed them all, like a lock all type of thing. But I think politically, on the British side, an arrest operation was much better. So I don't believe. I do remember a journalist, a Northern Ireland journalist, who was very astute, saying to me immediately after that operation that South Armagh decommissioned, and the sort of the media narrative would have been at that time sort of, well, oh, Adams and McGuinness want peace, and Slab Murphy and co, they want war. It's Sinn Féin and it's the IRA, and you
Mm-hmm.
know the men of peace and the hard men of violence. A lot of that's just total bullshit. They're all part of the same movement, and they have different roles to play, and they may have different emphasis on things. The idea of oh, hardliners and peacemakers, and that's these are sort of media constructs, and you get the same thing in like when people are writing about Iran or whatever, and they say, oh, the reformist mullahs,
Yeah.
or the or the moderates in Hamas or whatever. I mean, come on, you know. So and also obviously politically, the IRA violence was absolutely, I mean, there wouldn't have been a deal if there hadn't been the IRA.
Yeah.
It was not the Good Friday Agreement with the Alliance Party.
Mm-hmm.
And so having guns and bombing London and everything was the reason why the British were sitting up and taking notice. So I don't believe, and I also think, how would you, you know, how would you actually pull it off that sort of, Sinn Féin in Belfast or whatever, or arranged it so that a whole bunch of an IRA sniper team in South Armagh will be arrested. I just think that's sort of too neat, and it kind of gets into the realm of conspiracy theory where you just, it would just, can you imagine how many people would have had to have been involved in that, and
Mm-hmm.
how
Yeah.
you'd be pull that off? Now, I do
They
think the
did.
environment was probably such that, and this is why South Armagh never liked ceasefires, was because a ceasefire allows the British to a foothold,
Mm-hmm.
and also if you're saying to an IRA member or a family member, that I mean, you could make the case if you were like an MI5 officer or British military intelligence officer to somebody in South Armagh in 1997. Listen, you tell us, we've got this unit of it's sniper team. There's a peace process. If another British soldier is killed, it could derail a peace process. Look at the heartache your family's already gone through.
Mm-hmm.
Do you want to go through this? You've just been through this your entire generation. Do you want your children to go? So you can see how there's the kind of, it gives you leverage and pressure points to sort of recruit people.
Yeah.
And I was on, I mean, I remember being on doorsteps covering elections for the newspaper, but I was also researching the book, hearing some members of very prominent families in South Armagh saying so kind of it's time for peace. We've been through so much. So I think that's this sort of environment. I think they were infiltrated. I think it was an informant, because I think there's a reason why they'd identified that farm. The farm had probably been used before. You've got all these surveillance platforms from the towers, and so they, I mean, this was years of work of counter sniper work
Mm-hmm.
from SAS, from Green Army, from British military intelligence, and they had worked out that the next sniper operation was going to take place from this farm. And again, you never know did they follow the car? Did they follow a car to the farm? Did somebody tell them about the farm? Was somebody associated with the operation? A junior person, because you'd have to have a lot of dickers, surveillance people out on the roads. Did one of them talk? Did one of them? You never know. We will never know.
Yeah.
And in fact, kind of a recurring dream that I don't have anymore, but I used to have is being given a list of all the people throughout the Northern Ireland Troubles who'd been informants. Can you imagine?
Yeah.
Just that list, what that would tell you.
Yeah.
I mean,
yeah. I think part of the ingredients too is they may have gotten a little sloppy. because they were so successful for so long, they may have gotten a little bit, just not putting as much effort in. Not with their like there was surveillance on that farm for decades. I was there, and it's in the book where Slab Murphy grabbed the British soldier and dragged him into the south. Do you remember that part in the book?
Yes, oh yeah.
So I was there that night. I was on border patrol in Dundalk, and we got pulled out to the farm, because that's the farm we talked about earlier on. There's half in the north and half in the south, and somehow he had grabbed the British soldier and dragged him across into the south. And I remember that the guardie put him in the back of the police car, and he looked like he was like a kid. He looked like he was 12 years old, man. And now he's in a foreign country, and he's been rolled up. How do you disarm a British soldier on an OP watching your farm? I mean, he was a big man too, but I can't remember exactly how that happened.
So I think the British did the same though with Patrick Murphy, Tom's brother, who was video. So somebody was telling me about this the other day. Somebody who was there. That Patrick was videoing um, uh, the the British on the north side of the border in his farm,
Mm-hmm.
and he he got a bit he got a bit cocky, and they were
Mm.
kind of goading him, and he put a foot across, and
Yeah.
they arrested him.
Or they ran into the south and grabbed them. That's probably more likely, Yeah.
Apparently, I'm told, or maybe this was another case, similar case. They looked at the video camera and found, some interesting footage, should we say,
Mm.
on the video camera. So yeah, I mean, it's slightly uh, slightly comical, tug of war across the,
Yeah.
Ireland against England across
Yeah.
the.
It's not the border is not a line on the road. It's a line on a map, and there's no indication. I used to drive up to Northern Ireland when I lived there in my 20s to get gas, petrol, because it was so much cheaper in Northern Ireland. And when you cross from the south into the north, you knew you were crossing England because the roads were better.
Yeah, that's
and
right. You'd love to be like a bump, it'd be better tarmac. Yeah.
yeah. And we used to go up there when I was like a teenager. There was in Ward Point, there was like a flea market there, like every Sunday, where they sold all this crap really cheap because it was all probably stolen. And we used to go up there all the time. You know the main road from Dundalk to Newry, that main highway that has the massive checkpoint on it? I drove in there with 3 other guys in the Irish Army at the time, and we were going up into the Mourne Mountains to do like a mountain leader course. We drove to that checkpoint, and they pulled us into secondary search, right? And they pulled us all out of the car. And the British soldier searching put his weapon down right beside us and started searching the car. And I was like, is he trying to like tempt us to grab his weapon? Like, that's kind of dumb.
People make mistakes. There's a human factor. And so actually just on that checkpoint clog, there's a bit in Bandit Country where the IRA detonated a proxy bomb where they modified a van.
Yep.
And there were railway tracks.
Yep.
And they modified this van, put a massive bomb in it. I guess, was it radio controlled, or maybe the bomb was radio controlled, but I think it was just the incline on the tracks. And this bomb was basically slow rolled into the checkpoint. There was a ranger, a British Army ranger in there who just got on the radio and shouted, like, proxy bomb. And those are the last words he ever spoke. And I think he got the Queen's Gallantry Medal or something like that. It was blown up and he was killed. But just that warning enabled, a few people to sort of take cover.
Yeah, I think they took the tires off the van and they lifted it.
Yeah, so it's like on the rims, on the tracks.
And they lifted it on there with something like a bulldozer or something and put it on, and then just.
South Armagh had all these agricultural vehicles, and they knew how to sort of weld things, how to electrics, all that kind of stuff. Yeah. But on sort of the human factor, so when they were arrested, so the people who were arrested, Micheál Carraher, Seamus McArdle, who'd driven the Docklands bomb into London and was convicted of that. Martin Mines, Bernard McGinn, who was interestingly originally from Monaghan, and he was the guy who broke under interrogation,
Right. Yeah. He's an outsider. Yeah.
then recanted it. Um, but but he spoke. I mean, that was a very useful document for me for writing Bandit Country, because he took, he painted scenes and scene and named all the names. I couldn't use all the names, but named the names of the people who mixed the Docklands bomb in a cattle shed,
Yeah.
South Key bomb. But Mihal Kara, so he spoke about that sniper attack on Forkhill Base when Ronnie Galway was hit, but Mihal Kara had worn some very unusual shoes that had been sort of locally made. Um, and there was a footprint on the dog kennel that he'd been laying on.
Mm.
And um, I remember an IEC officer saying that he was sort of joking that they seized every pair of shoes in South Armagh, looking for
Yeah.
the shoe that matched that footprint. But when Caraher was arrested, he was either wearing or nearby was those shoes. So surprising, because he's a
Yeah.
professional. I would consider something like that a military professional.
Mm-hmm.
And the IRA was usually very kind of meticulous about forensic cleanup afterwards.
Mm-hmm.
So everything you'd worn, which had firearms residue and who knows, fibers, what kind of evidence, everything you'd worn when you'd done the attack, you would, put it into a trash bag and it would be incinerated. You'd have a shower
Yeah.
and that would include footwear. But again, you sort of sense a little bit of carelessness or cockiness.
Mm-hmm.
I'm going to wear my favorite pair of shoes
It's human
and
nature.
I'm going to keep
It
them.
is.
But
Yeah.
that
Mm-hmm.
convicted him
Yeah.
of that attempted murder.
Yeah. It's human nature, and it's on both sides. You get a little sloppy, you get comfortable, you get a little bolder, and you get away with it. You get a little bolder and bolder and bolder, right? You're not as scared. And it happens on both sides, and I've seen it happen on.
The things that the British were, they'd have OPs, observation posts. Um, they'd use the same places because it was a good place, but then obviously
Yep.
a farmer would see them, or
Yep.
they'd leave, sweet wrappers, cigarette butts,
Mm-hmm.
all those, basic sort of field craft. But people are humans.
Yep. They do. They make mistakes. Um, One last thing I want to talk about is the shiploads of arms that came in, and it wasn't just for South Armagh, but South Armagh were part of the system. And I think Slab Murphy actually went to Libya and
Yes.
and met with Gaddafi or Gaddafi's guy, and they sent how many shiploads of arms did Gaddafi send to the IRA?
Oh, it was three or four. In the end, uh, it was the operation was compromised, and there was a period, and there was also one that came in from Boston, the
Mm.
Marita Ann,
Yeah.
which was which the Irish authorities apprehended. But
Yeah.
yeah, so Slab Murphy was, one of the key figures in the liaison with Libya, which went back a long way. So I think Joe Carhill, famous IRA man in '73, had gone to Libya, but this
Mm.
was more in the early to mid '80s. Um, but South Armagh was key, and South and Tom Murphy was a sort of central figure and built up a relationship. Again, like a movie scene, really. Of you imagine Tom Murphy in Libya.
I know. Would it sunburn immediately?
I
Like
know, that's right.
this
Yeah.
this big patty out there getting burned and trying to speak to Libyans.
And so the Libyans gave gifts, and apparently they gave Tom Murphy like a massive sort of double bed.
Yeah,
Um,
it's a very Middle Eastern thing. It's a very Arab culture thing. Yeah.
they gave him
Uh,
lots of olive oil, and I
yeah.
don't know whether he uses much olive oil in his cooking, but
Yeah.
anyway, he
Probably
got lots of
not.
olive oil,
Yeah.
and he gave the Libyan guy an Alsatian dog.
Really, like a German Shepherd. Yeah. Yeah. Yeah.
That's right. So, yeah.
Where the hell? Yeah, that's weird. Um,
But basically, yeah, the amount of weapons and also Semtex. So Semtex came in, and so
So the thing about Semtex that people don't realize, at the time, Semtex was not detectable with all these explosive. So Semtex is high explosives like C4 or PE4, and a lot of the bombs up to then were homemade. Ammonium nitrate, fuel oil, homemade bombs. And homemade bombs are about a third, I think, as effective as actually commercial explosives. And when you have a homemade bomb like Anfo, you need commercial explosives to give it that kick, to send it off, right? You need a good detonator and commercial explosives. But if you have Semtex now that can't be detected by, whatever detection systems you have, and it's 3 times as effective as homemade explosives, then that's and it was a lot of Semtex too, right?
Yeah. So basically every IRA bomb, from the mid 80s onwards, had Semtex from Libya in it. And so South Armagh, I mean, again, I said all roads led to South Armagh. I mean, there was the training, the engineering department, the development of weapons, but also South Armagh was key in procurement. So in the United States, so a lot of the IRA bombs, they'd have Libyan Semtex, but they'd have American detonators. So that had been stolen or somehow bought or whatever in the United States for sort of blowing up rocks in
quarries,
mines in Arizona or whatever, and all sorts of restrictions on what you can buy and sell in Britain and maybe even in Europe, but much less so in the United States. And also, obviously, there's a Second Amendment here, so it's easy to procure weapons. And so there are lots of South Armagh guys. Again, it's in the book, who were in Fort Lauderdale, Florida, getting stuff. So it's just incredible how this tiny area and this incredibly close-knit group of people from all these sort of the tentacles sort of spread across the world.
Yeah, there's IRA guys, I think, with the PLO and all kinds of stuff early on.
Tentacles kind of spread across the world, and the IRA men arrested in Colombia. Late on, senior people
training the FARC.
Yes.
Yeah. So, is there anything, because it was written so long ago? Is there anything that has come out since? Because there's so much more information about the IRA now than there was when you wrote the book. Is there anything that has come out that has turned out different than you thought it was? If you made some assumptions or not, I'm just curious.
Actually, surprisingly not. I mean, so when it was going to be republished, there was a little bit of a debate about do I go back into it, and obviously there's one or two little things that might be wrong. Or there's, people have died, so you can name names, or there've been trials or things have happened. But I mean, I'm pleased to say it really did stand the test of time, and the decision, we made the decision like we're not going to go into it. It would be incredibly sort of complicated, and so I wrote a new foreword, and. So, for instance, the guy who's named as the Undertaker in the book was Patsy O'Callaghan, and he had died, and I identified as an IRA volunteer. And in fact, John Crawley, who wrote a pretty good book called The Yank recently, who was Irish American, was in the U.S. Marines. He gave an oration very recently for a commemoration. Patsy O'Callaghan. So I named him, and it was an update. But other than that, I think it was it was at the right time. It was sort of it was the end. It was pretty close to the end. And obviously, there was more about the real IRA and stuff's happens subsequently. I mean, somebody just sent me a link the other day that in 2023, a whole bunch of weapons and ammunition was seized in Crossmaglen, including 50 caliber rounds.
So much for decommissions, huh? Decommissioning guns, yeah.
So I know because serial numbers are in the book. There were 2 Barrett 90 sniper rifles. So one of them was found at the Craig and Duff farm. The other one's never been found. Yep. Do you think the IRA would have decommissioned a Barrett 90 bolt action.
At the time, they were like, "Oh, it's verified to decommission all the weapons," and I'll be like, "Ah, I find that very hard to believe." It's like one for you and one for us. Like, kind of let's keep some stuff back.
Like
Yeah,
it's like gun buyback programs here when they
Yeah.
they say,
Hmm.
oh, you can come. Do you think the best you're gonna give the best stuff in? No.
yeah. You'll give all the broken shit up, But I find it hard to believe. Guys, the book is Bandit Country. Please pick it up. It's a great book about Northern Ireland, and it will really give you an insight because I know there's a lot of interest, and you're way ahead of the game because there's a lot more information coming out now about the IRA, and more people are more willing to speak. But
Yeah.
this is the first book I because I was looking, I couldn't find anything that wasn't like biased one way or the other, and very accurate, very factual, and yeah, highly recommended. Can we talk about your new book, First Casualty? Because that I'm very interested in that too, and I haven't read it yet, but I absolutely will.
Yeah. So absolutely. So First Casualty is about CIA's Team Alpha, which was the first CIA team behind enemy lines after 9/11. So Jawbreaker had gone into the Panjshir Valley a bit earlier, like September 26, 2001. But that was Northern Alliance controlled territory. Also, the Tajiks were in disarray because Ahmed Shah Massoud had been assassinated by
Hmm.
Al Qaeda on September the 9th. Um, and by contrast, Team Alpha, so 8 members, Mike Spann, who was killed in the prisoner uprising in Kalajangi, November 25th, 2001. Um, that's where the title of the book comes from, the first casualty, the first
Hmm.
battlefield casualty of the war on terror.
I was in the prison in Mazar-e Sharif, wasn't it?
Yeah, that's right, just
Yeah.
outside Mazar,
Hmm.
yeah. And so it's the story of that team. They went in October 17th, they flew in Black Hawks from Kashi Khanabad, um, 3 days before ODA 595, who became known as the Horse Soldiers, were depicted in the movie 12 Strong. So they were the pathfinders for the ODA. But it's like eight guys, 2 case officers, 4 CIA paramilitary officers, one of them being Mike Spann,
Hmm.
one Green Beret, Justin Sapp, who I believe was the first American soldier into Afghanistan after 9/11 because he was on this team,
Mm.
Hmm.
and a medic.
Was he attached to them?
Yeah, he was part of the
Yeah.
team.
Yeah.
So his father had been in the CIA,
Hmm.
Mm-hmm.
and he was 29. He was 29 at the time. He just done the Special Forces dive school. So actually, the book starts with David Tyson, who was the guy who was with Mike, case officer who was with Mike um, when Mike was killed in the fort. A case officer, Uzbek speaker, um, sort of Central Asian specialist academic background. So
Hmm.
completely the opposite to a paramilitary officer. Um, so he's on 9/11, he's in the air. He's flying from Tashkent, where he's based, to London, who actually go speak to the station there about recovering Stinger missiles. So the ironies of history, the
Yeah.
Stinger missiles that have been
Hmm.
supplied to the Mujahideen by the CIA in the
Hmm.
1980s. So he's in the air. Justin's underwater, actually at Key West, Special Forces Dive School. And then Mike Spann is at CIA headquarters, actually just a couple of miles away from where I am here. So, land, sea, and air, that's how it kind of starts. So it's a story of that team being, I mean, everybody of a certain age will remember um, 9/11 vividly in that period afterwards where they're getting the teams together. They go over to Uzbekistan to K2, they fly in, and then they're in the Darya Suf Valley south of Mazar. Um, and Tajiks in the Panjshir aren't moving. They want money, they want air power, they want, all this kind of stuff. And um, Team Alpha links up with Abdul Rashid Dostum, a sort of warlord from Central
Yep.
Casting, ethnic Uzbek, reputed, and I think actually had done some terrible things. But he's America's man at the time. He's got the guys. This is what Robin Sage is about.
It is. Yep. It absolutely is. Yep.
G Chief, you know,
Yeah.
Yeah.
and so they link up with him. He's got the men. He's got the will to fight the Taliban. And once they coordinated, so Team Alpha was focusing on strategically on intelligence on Al Qaeda. Green Berets were focusing more on coordinating airstrikes and the actual sort of war fighting, that traditional split responsibilities. And so once the Green Berets and combat controllers had managed to coordinate sort of the awesome might of US air power with this sort of 19th century sort of cavalry that Dostum had. Once they managed to coordinate that, which they did um, sort of magnificently, then the Taliban just sort of folded and were routed. And then, and so Mazar-e-Sharif was the first domino to fall after 9/11. And so that was, I think, November 10th, 2001. So at the time, there was all this talk about getting bogged down. It's going to be another Afghanistan. We're going to be there till the spring. Well, obviously, we did end up being there 20 years, and it did become actually, almost twice as long as Vietnam. But in that early period, it actually was an incredible success and incredibly sort of quickly. But the sort of seeds of what happened later on, you can sort of see them in the uprising at Kalajangi, where there were 400 Al Qaeda prisoners who were taken to this fort, which I went to in 2020 as part of the research, and I interviewed Dostum and people who'd been there, and I interviewed the 6 surviving members of the CIA team as well. But you have all these Al Qaeda prisoners, and it all goes wrong. Incredible risk being taken by very small numbers of Americans, kind of covering vast swathes of territory. And obviously, in hindsight, you sort of wonder about the security of the prisoners, and but it was just for Team Alpha in a way. It wasn't just another day; it was an important moment. The first Al Qaeda prisoners after 9/11. But Dostum's guard force. The main effort was in Kunduz, 100 miles to the east, and so the guard force that Dostum had provided was not really up to it. They hadn't searched the prisoners properly. Like anything that goes sort of badly wrong, there are all these factors. You change one thing, and then it may not have happened. Justin Sapp was supposed to be with them that day. He had to go off and get a vehicle. If Justin had been there, one more person, he may have been killed. It may have been very different. But yeah, so the prisoners, they were being brought out of the Pink House, which is sort of fortified bunker underneath this Soviet-built schoolhouse inside the southern half of Kalajangi Fort. And nearly all the prisoners are out, but some of the really hardcore guys were the last to come out. And there's video footage because Dostum had a guy who was filming video of these prisoners. It's incredible watching it because you see Mike and David, and you see Mike questioning John Walker Lind, the so-called American Taliban, in fact, Al Qaeda guy, kind of weird guy from California, and then you hit right at the end of the video, it just kind of cuts. You hear shouts and sort of muffled explosions, and that's the uprising happening. And so the prisoners who are in this basement, they sort of rush out, they kill the guards. A lot of the other guards who are outside are either killed or flee. And Mike was very close to the Pink House, and he had a Glock and an AKMS, so like an AK with a folding stock. Pulls out his Glock, kills a few of them as they're rushing him, and same with his AK, but they're on him, and he's just kind of at the bottom of this sort of melee of Al Qaeda guys, some of whom are tied up because the guys who are tied up outside, they're taking part as well. Some of the guys from the inside, and it's just sort of an incredible. I mean, for years I'd wondered about this. I've seen some footage from German TV at the end of this when David Tyson's running through the northern.
I've seen that. Like, he was the other guy with Mike Spann, right? Was that the other guy? And he fights his way out. And I remember seeing a video of him out of breath when he got to safety. and he was like, you could tell he was flustered, like he just broke contact and fought for his life, and probably saw Mike Spann get attacked and taken down.
Oh yeah. So
But
what? So basically, that footage. Um, he's running. He's got an AK. He's wearing like you can tell he's this amalgam of American and Afghan stuff. So
mm-hmm.
he's
Yeah.
wearing like a like an Uzbek kind of tunic, but he's got jeans on.
Mm.
Um, sort of bearded. He's obviously a Westerner, and he's about 40 at the time. So not a particularly young guy. He he's got an AK in one hand. He's got his Browning high power pistol in the other, totally out of ammunition. But so what happened was, I spent hours and hours talking to David about this, and and it's an incredibly traumatic kind of
Yeah.
uh,
Mm-hmm.
episode. So so he has gaps in his memory. Um, but for him, he just went through this sort of incredible psychological experience
Mm.
where time slowed down. He lost hearing, um, although he could hear certain things, but a lot of things he couldn't hear.
Mm.
Everything's in slow motion, seconds like 2 minutes. Um, but there's a guy, so he hears this commotion. He's much further away from the pink house than Mike. Um, but he hears this commotion. He looks around and he's trying to grapple with what's going on. Sees a guy who he's previously interrogated, um, running towards him with a Makarov pistol, firing at him. But it's probably split seconds, but it seems like it takes minutes for him to realize,
Mm.
what's going on. He's like, shit, this guy's shooting at me. He can see the rounds being ejected. Um, uh, and he's like, oh shit, he's trying to kill me. Like, and then he's like, okay, what do I need to do? I need to shoot him. And he's got his pistol out. But David is not, an elite warrior. He's done his pistol course at the CIA, but he hasn't fired his pistol for years. So he's thinking, shit, do I know how to fire this thing? Um, and then he shoots him, and
Mm.
he shoots him twice and kills him.
Mm.
And he hears Mike shouting, "Dave, Dave, Dave!" And all Afghans are fleeing. So David, um, had the opportunity to, I guess, to save his skin and just run the other way. And that would have been a human thing to do, and you could
Yeah.
have
Mm-hmm.
intellectually afterwards, you could have justified it. I guess you could have said, "Well, Mike was probably dead already," or would have been in seconds. But anyway, David ran towards Mike. He gets there. There's this, all this kind of pile of Al Qaeda guys on top of Mike, um, and he um, he shot the four guys on top of Mike. And he shoots them one, two, three, four, and then four, three, two, one. So he shoots each of them twice, kind of in order, and
Mm.
then going back. But then there's like blood, on the ground. He kicks Mike. Mike's not moving, and we now know because I got the autopsy report that Mike was killed like with a single round to the temple with a contact wound. So
Yeah.
almost probably, by his own Glock. Um, and his body was recovered sort of 5 or 6 days later. But then at that point, then David he picks up Mike's AK, and he has grenades bouncing off him that didn't explode.
Mm.
He had one guy head who's tied up and he's sort of like headbutting him, and he shoots him over his shoulder. And sort of just very, very few people, I think, have gone through something like that
Yeah.
and lived to tell a
He's
tale. So
yeah. He's probably got a lot of trauma because, in my experience, it's guys. The killing people is not the PTSD thing. It's losing friends and survivor guilt. And I should have done this and I should have done that, and that's what crushes people later on in life. So I imagine he every day since he's been. I should have done this, and if only I'd done this, and that road lead nowhere, right? But it's hard to tell someone that.
yeah, I mean, I think one of the things with David, and we've talked about this a lot, and we still do talk about it, is is he it even connects with some of the IRA stuff, really. Um, he, the way he views it is these were Al Qaeda guys. It was sort of it was a fair fight. It wasn't like he wasn't dropping missiles, it was like kill or be killed. Like
Hmm.
they were there, they had their beliefs. He was there, he had his beliefs. They were trying to kill him. He was killing them, stop them killing him, and he did everything he could.
Yeah.
Um, and but yeah, Mike was younger, and David had said, if you put the two of us alongside each other and said which one of these guys is going to survive, and you would have said Mike, but Mike was he was just closer to
Yep.
the pink house, and that's the way it sort of unfolded.
Mhm.
And but Mike had, he had three kids. He had two daughters. He had a baby son that was just a few months old. And so, yeah, David thinks about that all the time. David had two kids, but he's gone through the whole thing of like, why did I survive, and
Mhm.
why did Mike not? Um, but one of the incredible things, which is sort of really um, what's happened since the book, because the book was first published September 2021, so a month after the collapse in Kabul and the kind of shameful kind of end to
Yeah.
this whole thing.
Horrible. Yeah.
Yeah. Um, but David and Shannon Spann, who was Mike's widow, who was a CIA officer herself at the
Mm.
time, um, they founded, and Justin's involved, and I'm involved on the board, and Andy, who was another Team Alpha member, who was sort of the last guy to retire from the CIA person to retire from the team. Started a group called Badger 6, which was the call sign for this sub operation that Mike, Justin, and Mark Rausenberger, who was the medic who died in the Philippines in 2016, 2017. So that their sub mission to Bamiyan province in these very early days was call sign was Badger 6. So the charity is called Badger 6, and that's to bring back the Afghan allies from that period. So basically,
Mhm.
the people who worked with ODA 595, ODC 53, which was the battalion element that came in, and Team Alpha. So families, guys or families, some of them are widow families now, um, that the Americans on the ground knew. So it's very specific. It's like
Mm.
it's big families. It's actually in total it's close to 500 people, and it's getting those allies out. And so what's happening now is every day, David, who was with Mike Spann when he was killed, is working with Shannon Spann, who was newly married, had a baby son, and
Mm.
they're working together, well over 20 years later, to sort of do right by these Afghan allies in a way that Mike Spann, um, you know, would have wanted. So
Mhm.
I think that's part of the healing for
Mm.
both Shannon and David that came from this, which is kind of a humbling thing to watch. And they don't talk about it, but that's the undercurrent to everything they're doing. And
Mhm.
but occasionally I'll see them together, talking, or I'll be on a call with them, and I just think like, you know, wow,
Yeah. Yeah.
given what happened on November 25th, 2001, that these two
Mhm.
people are sort of are working together. They know
Yeah.
what's all the history,
Mhm.
but they're just focused on trying to get these people out. And we've had a lot of kind of success recently. Um, it's incredible. There are like little pockets of Afghans in New Jersey, in Boise, Idaho, in
Mhm.
Kentucky,
Yeah.
who will
Yeah.
become part of the fabric of this nation in
Yeah.
future generations. So
Some of the role players at Robin Sage are from this local area in North Carolina. They're Montagnard family from Vietnam.
oh, okay, yeah,
They were brought back from they work with special operations, and the older dad obviously is the guy who actually worked with American SOF in Vietnam, and then his whole extended family, and they're all out there playing a role as guerrillas that the ODA learned to deal with and all that, and it's really cool, man. It's really cool to see.
you see that
Um,
around here. There's a place called the Eden Center nearby, which is loads of Vietnamese restaurants. And these were people, yes, who were brought back, like there were nuns, Montagnards,
Yeah, yeah,
who were
yeah,
brought
yeah.
back by the people who, again, kind of a shameful withdrawal and abandonment of allies,
Yeah,
when Saigon fell in 1975. And
yeah.
yet, like, often outside the government, in fact, it tends to be usually outside the government in the end, just, great Americans sort of doing the right thing. And that adds these like ethnic groups to this country, which is part of it's
Yeah.
incredible. And so I
There's a guy.
see it around here,
Yeah, there's a guy in Texas, Omar, who was in the Iraqi counter-terrorist force and fought side by side with American special forces, and then he got American citizenship. And I met him a while. Like, he is an American. Like, he's got a baseball cap and a pickup truck, and he is and proud to be an American, And really cool guy, and really cool to see. And he fought hard.
I mean, I don't know how you feel, but I feel I made a choice to be American. I'm very proud.
Me too.
American.
Yep.
And I know what it is to not be American, but being from the UK is, it's not like being under the yoke of fascism or communism.
It's getting there with Keir Starmer.
But yeah, I mean, I think people who've chosen to be American and who've experienced life on the other side, and they get here. I mean, here you never know who your Uber driver is going to be, And I love talking to them, and it's like, particularly if they're from Afghanistan, what's the story? But yeah, these people tend to love America because they know, for all the kind of stuff that happens here, they know, what freedom is. They know what the American dream is. They know what it's like on the other side, and they've chosen to be here. Often a great sacrifice, because you have people, doctors and lawyers and who are driving Ubers or working at the checkout in Giant or whatever, just so they can get enough money to send. And often then English isn't great for the kids to go to school, and then hopefully then the next generation is going to be is going to be fired up with as America.
And I think America gets a bad rap in places like England and Ireland, stuff like that, because people focus on the negative. Yeah, there's a lot of crime here. There's also 330 million people here, right? But the freedoms that you enjoy here are hard to see unless you've been somewhere else. And Americans take it for granted a lot. So I don't call myself Irish American. I call myself American. And I've been in the States longer than I lived in Ireland. And I served the American military and I'm proud to be an American. And my wife's naturalized U.S. citizen as well. She grew up in Sweden, and my kids are all American citizens, right? But when you see it on another side, and not that Ireland or England are like extreme fucking tough countries to live in, but it's all a lot of little things. Like in Ireland, you have to have a license to have a TV. Like, what the fuck is that about? And even if you don't watch regular TV, you're just streaming. You have to, and if you have two TVs, you have to have two licenses. You need a license to have a dog. Like, there's a lot of little things like that. I'm like, that makes no fucking sense to me.
The president in Britain, you have the class system, but also the presence of the government. It's so much more. I mean, oppressive is too strong, but it's very close. Like, there's a lot of stuff you have to get permission to do it. Whereas here, there is a sort of a freedom, which can be pretty messy sometimes.
Yeah.
Yeah,
I love it. I am going to read your book, and I'd love to have you back and talk more about First Casualty, because it is a fascinating time. And there was a lot of mistakes made early in the GWAT because we weren't ready for it. And just hearing you talk about Mazar-e-Sharif, those guys didn't know they were going to take 400 freaking prisoners in a very short period of time and have no idea what to do with them. Like, so mistakes were made, and were made for the whole freaking GWAT. I mean, we got our shit together a lot later on, but the political will wasn't there, almost like Vietnam. But so I'm absolutely going to read that. If you would do an audiobook, that would make it a lot easier for me, who drives a lot.
I'd like to. So if anybody knows how Bandit Country was first published in 99, so no audiobooks.
Mm-hmm.
And so it's now being republished in print. But if anybody knows how you do an audiobook, then I'd love to get it out on audio. And actually kind of connected to what we've just been talking about. I'm working on a new book, deep into the writing of it, which is about a CIA Gallantry Award and its recipients, and a number of those were not natural-born Americans, including one who actually was in the OSS in World War II, who was originally born in Vienna and grew up in Yugoslavia, and then an incredible Afghan American who was a recipient as well, connected to the Bin Laden operation. And so I've been thinking a lot about what it means to be an American and in this country. And those two guys, one who was from a Jewish background, one who's a Muslim, they loved America and the idea of America before they even got here, which I think is an incredible.
Yep. You live in Virginia, right?
That's right. Yeah.
Yeah. I'm teaching a 2-day precision rifle class in April at Pig River Precision in Virginia. You need to come shoot long guns with me, man. You need to come. Okay. I'll lend you the gun and everything. Come shoot some sniper stuff with me, man, and we'll be crushing targets out to like 1,200 fucking 308s, man, all day long. Toby, thank you so much for sitting down and talking to me, man. I had a blast. I love talking about it. I love history, and the books you write. The only thing I read is military nonfiction. I really don't read anything else. But because I grew up here. The Northern Ireland thing really and I work Robin Sage now as a G chief, so it's guerrilla warfare. It's very, very similar in a lot of ways, and a lot of lessons learned I can apply, So I've been really digging into Irish history and Northern Ireland and talking to Oisin on some podcasts and stuff, and I'm going to keep hammering away at it, but it like I said, it was hard to find. Have you found any other books, not that we're trying to deflect from yours, but about Northern Ireland? What was the one you said that British officer wrote?
Oh, that's Emergency Corps. That's an old book. That was probably published in the 80s. But, 10 Men Dead by David Beresford, who was a Guardian correspondent about the hunger strikers. That's an incredible book.
Yeah, I remember that growing up. I was in school. And I remember going in on the bus, and there'd be people lying on the side of the road in paramilitary uniforms with black flags, and it was a weird time in Ireland, man. It really was.
Recently, Say Nothing by Patrick Radden Keefe is very good, and is
Yeah, I've listened to that on audio.
Very successful book.
Yeah, I thought initially when I heard it, I thought it was a little biased to the IRA, but it evened out over time, and it's a very broad kind of 30-year history of certain people, but it was quite good. I haven't seen the TV show.
Yeah. Kevin Toulis wrote a book called Rebel Hearts, which was very, very good. And then another one, which is kind of close to home, Eamon Collins, who was an IRA guy who became a supergrass, then recanted, and then was then murdered brutally by the IRA in the late 90s. But I knew Eamon very well. I interviewed him for Bandit Country extensively, but he wrote a book called Killing Rage, which is raw, because Eamon, he sort of fell out with the IRA and turned against them, but he would switch sometimes in the same conversation, to sort of, vilifying them and praising them. So a part of him had sort of never left part of them had never left him. And that's one of the reasons why he was killed, because he wouldn't, he remained living in Newry against all advice and common sense, because I think he still thought. I didn't think he would quite sort of emotionally realized. He thought he was still part of it, but he wasn't. But that's an incredible book about the raw.
Don't read any of them until you read Bandit Country. All right, then you can start reading those.
But there's a lot of good books out there.
Yeah. All right, Toby. Thank you so much, man. I really appreciate it. Had a blast, and I'll put your website link down below in the comments or in the section on YouTube. But and then we'll add some pictures to the YouTube video to make things more clear. But I appreciate you sitting down with me, man. I know you got to run.
Okay.
And I'd like to do it again after I read your
Sure.
next book. Thanks, brother.
All right. Thanks so much,
Okay.
Kevin.